A woman's ex-husband invited her to his wedding just to watch her suffer. But what happened when she walked through those doors changed everything. Daniel Harris thought he was setting up the perfect humiliation. His discarded ex-wife would sit in the shadows while he paraded his new life with a younger woman. He had no idea Claire Morgan was about to rewrite his entire wedding day. 2 years earlier, Claire was broken, abandoned, and left with nothing but shattered dreams. Everyone whispered about her downfall. Her replacement moved into her old life, wearing her jewelry, visiting her favorite places. But when that invitation arrived with its cruel handwritten note, Daniel made one fatal mistake. He underestimated what a woman can become when she refuses to stay broken. What you're about to discover will show you the exact moment a humiliation trap backfired spectacularly. You'll witness the entrance that silenced an entire wedding reception. Learn how one woman transformed herself so completely that she became unrecognizable. And see why sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person they never believed you could be. Stay with us to uncover how a midnight blue gown became a weapon of quiet power, why the bride disappeared to the bathroom for 30 minutes, and the shocking text messages that proved this ex-husband's biggest mistake wasn't just losing her once. It was trying to hurt her twice. Because this isn't just about a wedding crasher. It's about transformation, dignity, and the moment when someone who thought they controlled your story realizes they were just a chapter in yours. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, but I caught it just before it hit the kitchen counter. The words coming out of Daniel's mouth were rearranging themselves in my head, refusing to make sense. Claire, you've changed. I need someone who keeps things exciting. He was leaning against our granite countertop, the one we'd picked out together 3 years ago, arguing over whether to choose the speckled pattern or the solid gray. Now he stood there like a stranger, discussing the end of our 6-year marriage as casually as he might comment on the weather forecast. The spring afternoon light filtered through our bay window, casting shadows across his face that made him look older somehow. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his work shirt still crisp despite the long day. Everything about him screamed success, control, confidence. Everything except his eyes, which couldn't quite meet mine. What does that mean exactly? I heard myself ask, though part of me already knew. The late nights, the phone calls he took in the other room, the way he'd started looking at me like I was furniture he'd grown tired of. It means Jessica understands what I need. The name hit me like a physical blow. Jessica Reed, 24 years old, blonde, fresh out of college, and working as an assistant at his marketing firm. I'd met her at the Christmas party, watched her laugh too loudly at his jokes, noticed how her hand lingered on his arm when she handed him drinks. How long? My voice sounded strange, distant. Does it matter? He straightened up, running a hand through his hair, the same gesture I'd once found endearing. The point is, this isn't working anymore, Claire. We both know it. The "we both" part was rich. I'd been working overtime to save our marriage while he'd been working overtime to replace me. The couple's therapy sessions he'd started canceling, the weekend trips he'd stopped planning, the way he'd begun treating our home like a hotel he was eager to check out of. 6 years, Daniel, 6 years of marriage, and you're ending it because Jessica Reed understands what you need? He had the decency to look uncomfortable for about 3 seconds. Then his jaw set in that stubborn line I knew too well. I'm not happy, Claire. Haven't been for a long time. You've become predictable, comfortable. I need someone who challenges me. The irony was staggering. I'd spent the last 2 years of our marriage walking on eggshells, trying to become whatever version of myself might make him happy again. I'd signed up for cooking classes because he complained about our dinners. I'd tried new hairstyles because he'd made comments about my boring look. I'd even suggested we take salsa dancing lessons together, only to have him dismiss it as not his thing. But apparently all that effort had made me predictable. So you're leaving me for her. It wasn't a question. I'm leaving you for me, he said, and I almost laughed at the selfishness wrapped up in what he probably thought was profound honesty. Jessica she gets it. She gets me. What Jessica got was a successful 35-year-old man with a corner office and a healthy bank account. What I'd gotten was 6 years of marriage to someone who'd apparently been shopping for my replacement the entire time. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of our neighbors mowing their lawn and the distant hum of traffic. Normal sounds from a normal Saturday afternoon that had just become anything but normal. "I'll pack my things tonight," he said finally. "The lawyer will be in touch about the details." The lawyer. He'd already seen a lawyer. This conversation wasn't the beginning of our end. It was just the formal announcement. The decision had been made weeks, maybe months ago, in boardrooms and fancy restaurants, and probably Jessica's apartment. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He walked past me toward the stairs, and I caught a whiff of cologne I didn't recognize. Even his scent belonged to someone else now. After he left that night, 3 suitcases and a sheepish expression at the door, I sat in our living room and tried to figure out what hurt most. The betrayal, obviously. The humiliation of being replaced by someone barely old enough to rent a car. But underneath all that was something else. The crushing realization that I'd been married to someone who could dismantle an entire life with such cold efficiency. The house felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. Every corner held memories that now seemed like lies. The couch where we'd planned our future. The kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals. The wedding photos on the mantel that suddenly looked like portraits of strangers. I spent that first night on the bathroom floor crying until my chest ached, and my eyes were too swollen to produce more tears. The tile was cold against my cheek, and I remember thinking this must be what rock bottom felt like, literally lying on the ground with nowhere left to fall. But even in that moment, some small voice in the back of my mind whispered something that would prove prophetic. This wasn't my ending. This was just Daniel's version of events. And I was about to write my own. Chapter 2. The Whispers. Small towns have big mouths, and even though we lived in an upscale neighborhood outside Boston, word traveled with the speed of gossip and the precision of guided missiles. Within a week, everyone in our social circle knew that Daniel Harris had traded in his wife for a newer model. The reactions came in waves, each one more humiliating than the last. First were the pitying looks at the grocery store. Women I'd chatted with for years suddenly developed intense interest in their shopping lists when they saw me coming down the cereal aisle. The brave ones offered thin smiles and asked how I was holding up, their voices heavy with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. Then came the invitations that stopped arriving. Dinner parties I would have been automatically included in suddenly happened without me. Couples game nights that had been monthly traditions quietly resumed with Jessica filling my seat. I understood the math. Divorce made people uncomfortable, especially when it was messy and public. No one wanted to choose sides, so they chose the path of least resistance, the couple that was still intact. But the worst were the ones who did reach out, armed with advice that cut deeper than silence ever could. "You'll find someone better," they'd say, patting my arm with the confidence of people who'd never had their lives imploded without warning. Daniel never deserved you anyway. If Daniel never deserved me, what did that say about my judgment? About the 6 years I'd spent trying to build a life with him? About the woman who'd been so easily replaced by someone with fewer wrinkles and a more flexible schedule? The most brutal encounters happened at the places I couldn't avoid. The bank, where the teller who'd processed our joint accounts for years now looked at me with naked curiosity. The dry cleaner, where Daniel's shirts no longer hung next to my dresses. The coffee shop where we'd spent Sunday mornings reading the paper together, now a minefield of memories I couldn't navigate without feeling like I was going to shatter into pieces. 3 weeks after he moved out, I ran into Rebecca Walsh at Target. Rebecca had been the self-appointed social coordinator of our neighborhood, the woman who organized block parties and knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. She cornered me in the paper towel aisle with the determination of an investigative journalist. "Claire, honey, I heard about you and Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of concern that was really just curiosity wearing a disguise. I have to say I'm not entirely surprised. I gripped my shopping cart handle tighter. "Oh? Well, you know how men are at his age. They start panicking about getting older, feeling like they've missed out on something." She leaned closer, conspiratorial. "Between you and me, I saw them together at Cafe Luna last month. Very cozy. I thought maybe you knew and were okay with it." The image hit me like a slap. Cafe Luna was our place. Daniel and I had gone there for our first official date, celebrated our engagement there, marked anniversaries at our favorite corner table. The idea of him sitting in that same booth with Jessica, probably telling her the same stories he'd once told me, ordering the same wine we'd shared during happier times. It was a violation that went beyond simple infidelity. I should have said something, Rebecca continued, clearly enjoying her role as the bearer of devastating news. But you know how awkward these situations are. You never know if you should get involved. What she meant was, you never know if you should miss out on front row seats to someone else's humiliation. I mumbled something about needing to finish my shopping and escaped, leaving my half-full cart abandoned in the aisle. In the parking lot, I sat in my car with the engine running and the air conditioning blasting, trying to process the fact that my marriage had been a public spectacle for longer than I'd realized. Everyone had known. The pitying looks weren't just about the divorce. They were about the fact that I'd been the last person to figure out my own life was falling apart. That night, I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I looked at Jessica's social media. It was exactly what I'd expected, and somehow worse than I'd imagined. She'd been posting photos of their relationship for months, carefully cropped to avoid showing Daniel's face clearly, but obvious enough to anyone who knew what to look for. Expensive dinners at restaurants I recognized, weekend trips to places Daniel and I had talked about visiting, a selfie taken in what was clearly the front seat of his car. The captions were the worst part. Coy little declarations about finding your person when you least expect it, and sometimes the best things come to those who wait. As if I had been an obstacle in their love story rather than a wife who'd been systematically replaced. But it was the engagement announcement posted just 6 weeks after our divorce was finalized that nearly broke me completely. A photo of Jessica's hand displaying a ring that was easily twice the size of the one Daniel had given me. The caption read, "When you know, can't wait to start forever with my best friend." Soulmate. Next, chapter 6 Chari, blessed. The ring alone probably cost more than our entire wedding had. The photographer was clearly professional. The staging was perfect. Manicured nails, soft lighting, the perfect amount of background blur to suggest luxury without being gauche about it. Daniel had proposed to her the way he'd never proposed to me. With planning, with investment, with the kind of grand gesture that said this time it mattered. This time it was real. I closed the laptop and sat in my empty house, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion. Outside, I could hear life continuing. Cars pulling into driveways, families having dinner, people moving through their normal routines without having to question whether everything they'd believed about their lives had been a carefully constructed lie. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I refused to disappear quietly. I refused to let Daniel's narrative be the only one that mattered, and I absolutely refused to let him have the satisfaction of thinking he'd broken me beyond repair. I had no idea how I was going to rebuild my life, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woman who emerged from this wreckage was going to be someone neither Daniel nor Jessica could have imagined in their wildest dreams. The whispers would continue, but eventually they were going to be about something entirely different. Chapter 3. The Catalyst. Emily Carter saved my life on a Tuesday night in October, though she did it by threatening to end our friendship if I didn't get my act together. I'd been divorced for 3 months and had perfected the art of existing, without actually living. My routine had become pathetically predictable. Work, grocery store, home, repeat. I'd stopped wearing makeup because what was the point? Stopped returning phone calls because I had nothing interesting to say. Stopped looking in mirrors because the woman staring back at me looked like a ghost of someone I used to know. Emily had been trying to reach me for weeks, leaving increasingly concerned voicemails that I'd been ignoring with the dedication of someone committed to her own misery. But that Tuesday, she'd had enough. She showed up at my door with a bottle of wine and the kind of expression that meant business. "Open the door, Claire. I can see your car in the driveway and the lights are on. I'm not leaving until we talk." I considered pretending I wasn't home, but Emily had a key and the determination to use it. I opened the door to find my best friend since college standing on my porch, with her arms crossed and her patience clearly exhausted. She took one look at me. Unwashed hair, yesterday's sweatpants, the general appearance of someone who'd given up on basic human maintenance, and pushed past me into the living room. Jesus, Claire, when's the last time you left this house for something that wasn't absolutely necessary? I leave the house, I protested weakly. I go to work, I run errands. That's not living, that's surviving. There's a difference. She set the wine on the coffee table and turned to face me, with the kind of directness that had made her successful in her law career, and occasionally terrifying as a friend. How long are you planning to let Daniel control your life? He's not controlling my life. He's not even in my life anymore. Exactly my point. Emily uncorked the wine with more force than necessary. He left, Claire. He moved on. He's probably planning some elaborate engagement party while you're here wearing sweatpants that look like they've been in a fight with a washing machine and lost. The truth stung because it was so accurate it hurt. I had been stuck in a holding pattern for months, waiting for something to change without actually doing anything to change it. I don't know how to move on, I admitted, sinking onto the couch. I don't even know who I am without him. We were together for 6 years, Emily. I defined myself by that relationship for so long. I can't remember what I was like before. Emily poured 2 generous glasses of wine and handed me one. Then figure it out. But do it as the person you're becoming, not the person he left behind. What if I can't? What if this is it for me? What if Daniel was right and I really am predictable and boring and... Stop! Emily's voice cut through my spiral with surgical precision. Right there. Stop letting his opinion of you become your opinion of yourself. Daniel Harris is a man who threw away 6 years of marriage because a 24-year-old paid attention to him at office parties. His judgment is not exactly reliable. She sat beside me on the couch, her expression softening slightly. Claire, I've known you since we were 18 years old. I've watched you talk your way out of parking tickets, negotiate raises that made your male colleagues weep with envy, and once convince the entire restaurant to stay open past closing time because you really wanted their chocolate souffle. You are not boring. You're not predictable. You just forgot who you were for a while. The wine was making me emotional, or maybe it was the first real conversation I'd had in months. What if I try to change and I fail? What if I put myself out there and just end up looking pathetic? Then you'll look pathetic temporarily while figuring out how to look spectacular permanently. But staying here, hiding in your house, wearing clothes that smell like defeat, that's not protection, Claire. That's just a slower way of disappearing. She was right, and I hated her for it. I also loved her for it, which is what 20 years of friendship looks like. Someone who cares enough to tell you the truth even when it hurts. So what do? I asked, feeling like a teenager asking for advice about boys. You remember who you were before Daniel convinced you to be smaller? You join that gym you keep talking about. You take that marketing course you've been researching for months. You start dating when you're ready, or don't date if you're not ready. But you do it because you want to, not because you're afraid of what people will think. Emily stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where everyone knew my business and had opinions about my choices. Most importantly, you stop living your life in reaction to his. Stop proving you're fine. Stop trying to show everyone you're not broken. Just be whoever the hell you want to be and let the chips fall where they may. That conversation was the kick in the pants I'd been too afraid to give myself. Emily left around midnight, but not before making me promise to do 3 things. Join a gym within the week, sign up for that marketing course, and throw away the sweatpants that had become my uniform of surrender. The next morning, I stood in my bathroom and really looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me wasn't the confident, ambitious person I'd been before my marriage started falling apart. But she wasn't the broken shell I'd been inhabiting either. She was someone in between, someone with potential, someone who could choose what came next. I took a shower that lasted 45 minutes. I used the expensive shampoo I'd been saving for special occasions. I put on real clothes and actual makeup. I looked in the mirror again, and this time I smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and rusty from disuse. But it was mine. That afternoon, I drove to the gym Emily had recommended. The trainer's name was Sophia Martinez, and she had the kind of energy that made you feel like excuses were not only unwelcome, but physically impossible in her presence. "What are your goals?" she asked after I'd filled out the paperwork and stood awkwardly in the pristine fitness center, feeling like an imposter among all the confident, athletic people. I want to remember what it feels like to be strong, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. Sophia studied me for a moment, and I had the feeling she'd heard that response before, in different words from other women who'd found themselves starting over. Then let's get you strong. The first workout nearly killed me. I could barely jog a mile without feeling like my lungs were going to explode. My muscles shook during exercises that other people seemed to complete effortlessly. I went home that evening with everything aching and collapsed on my couch, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. But the next morning I woke up feeling different. Not better exactly, but different. Like my body was remembering it could do things besides simply exist. I went back the next day and the day after that. And slowly, incrementally, something started to shift. It wasn't just physical, though. After 2 months, I could run 3 miles without dying and lift weights that would have seemed impossible when I started. It was deeper than that. Each workout was a small rebellion against the woman Daniel had left behind. Each mile I ran was distance between who I'd been and who I was becoming. The marketing course came next. Advanced Executive Marketing Strategy at Boston University, 3 nights a week for 4 months. I'd been researching it for over a year, always finding reasons to postpone enrollment. Too expensive, wrong timing, maybe next semester. Now I signed up and paid the tuition without overthinking it. If I was going to rebuild my life, I might as well rebuild it bigger and better than before. The first night of class, I sat in the back row and listened to Professor Williams outline the curriculum. Strategic planning, consumer psychology, digital marketing trends, brand development. It was exactly the kind of advanced knowledge I'd needed in my previous job, but never felt qualified to pursue. The most successful marketers, Professor Williams said during that first lecture, understand that they're not just selling products, they're selling transformation. The promise that purchasing this item or service will make customers into better versions of themselves. I looked around the classroom at my fellow students, ambitious professionals looking to advance their careers, entrepreneurs launching startups, managers seeking promotions, all of us betting on ourselves in different ways. For the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The coursework was challenging in the best possible way. I found myself staying up late working on presentations, researching case studies, collaborating with classmates on group projects. My brain, which had been in hibernation mode for months, suddenly woke up and remembered how much it enjoyed being challenged. 3 months into my new routine of morning workouts and evening classes, I caught my reflection in a store window while walking to grab lunch between work and school. The woman looking back at me was someone I almost didn't recognize. She stood straighter, moved with purpose, looked like she had places to be and things to accomplish. Her clothes fit better, her hair looked healthier, and there was something in her expression that hadn't been there in a long time. Confidence. I wasn't the same person I'd been before Daniel. I was realizing I didn't want to be. That woman had been wonderful, but she'd also been someone who could be easily diminished by one man's opinion. The woman I was becoming felt more solid somehow, less likely to shatter when life got complicated. Emily noticed the change immediately when we met for dinner that weekend. "You look different," she said, studying my face across the table. "Good different. Like you've been remembering something important." "I have been," I told her. "I've been remembering that I actually like myself when I'm not trying to be someone else's idea of perfect." That night, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I went shopping for clothes. Not practical clothes or comfortable clothes or clothes that would help me blend into the background. Clothes that made me feel powerful. I found a midnight blue dress that fit like it had been designed specifically for my body. Floor length with subtle sequins that caught the light when I moved. The neckline was daring without being inappropriate. The train was long enough to make an entrance, but not so dramatic that I'd trip walking downstairs. I had no idea when I'd wear it. No special occasions on my calendar, no events that called for formal attire. But something about that dress felt like a promise to myself, that there would be occasions worthy of it, that the woman I was becoming would have reasons to dress up and places to go that mattered. I bought it without trying to justify the expense or find a practical reason. I bought it because I wanted it, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like reason enough. 6 months after Emily's intervention, I was completing my marketing certification with a final project that had caught the attention of 3 different companies. My body was stronger than it had been in years. My confidence was returning in waves. I still thought about Daniel sometimes, but not with the raw pain that had characterized those first few months. Now it was more like curiosity about a story I'd once been part of, but had outgrown. I heard through mutual friends that he and Jessica were planning an elaborate engagement party, that they'd moved into a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and hosted dinner parties I wasn't invited to. It should have hurt. A year ago, it would have destroyed me. Now, it felt like news about strangers. Interesting, but ultimately irrelevant to my life. I was learning the difference between moving on and moving forward. Moving on suggested leaving something behind. Moving forward meant taking the best parts of who I'd been and building something better with them. I had no idea that in just 2 months, I'd have the perfect opportunity to showcase exactly how far forward I'd moved. That a single envelope would arrive with the power to test everything I'd rebuilt. That Daniel Harris, in his infinite arrogance, would give me the chance to demonstrate the difference between the woman he'd left and the woman I'd become. But for now, I was content to keep building, keep growing, keep becoming someone who could surprise herself. The best was yet to come. Chapter 4. The Revelation. Milan in springtime is a city that makes you believe in possibilities. The fashion capital of the world has a way of reminding you that transformation is not only possible but expected, which is probably why it was the perfect place for me to meet the man who would change everything. I'd been in Italy for a week, leading a marketing consultation for a luxury brand looking to expand into the American market. It was my first major project since completing my certification, and landing the contract had felt like vindication for every late night I'd spent studying. Every morning I dragged myself to the gym when all I wanted to do was hide under the covers. The work was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been craving. Complex, creative, high stakes. The client was launching a line of sustainable luxury handbags and needed someone who understood both the European aesthetic and American consumer psychology. For the first time in years, I felt like I was using every part of my brain, drawing on knowledge and instincts I'd forgotten I possessed. But it was at the tech conference after party, held in a renovated palazzo overlooking the cathedral, that my life took another unexpected turn. I almost hadn't gone. After a long day of presentations and client meetings, my hotel room and room service had sounded infinitely more appealing than making small talk with strangers in a language I only half spoke. But my client, Sophia Benedetti, had insisted. "Claire, you must come. The best connections happen when business hours end." Besides, she'd added with the kind of smile that suggested she knew something I didn't, "You never know who you might meet." The party was everything I'd expected. Beautiful people in expensive clothes discussing deals and innovations over champagne and artfully arranged canapes. I'd been making polite conversation with a group of tech entrepreneurs when I noticed him. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked effortlessly styled, and the kind of presence that drew attention without seeming to try. He was speaking to a small group near the terrace, and something about his gestures suggested he was telling a story that had his audience genuinely engaged. What struck me wasn't his appearance, though he was undeniably handsome in that understated way that suggests confidence rather than vanity. It was the way he listened when someone else was talking. Actually listened with his full attention, instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. It had been so long since I'd seen that quality in a man that I found myself staring longer than was probably polite. "That's Alexander Bennett," Sophia said, appearing at my elbow with fresh champagne and a knowing look. "He spoke at the conference today about sustainable technology solutions. Brilliant man. Also single if you're interested." I felt my cheeks warm. I wasn't. "Of course you weren't," Sophia interrupted with a laugh. "You were just admiring his innovative approach to renewable energy. Very professional curiosity." Before I could protest further, Sophia was steering me toward his group. "Alexander, I'd like you to meet Claire Morgan. She's the marketing strategist I told you about, the one helping us launch in America." He turned toward me, and I was struck by two things immediately. His eyes were the exact shade of green I'd always thought only existed in photographs, and his smile was the kind that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. "The famous Claire Morgan," he said, extending his hand. "Sophia's been singing your praises all week. She says you're revolutionizing their brand strategy. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and he held eye contact just long enough to feel intentional without crossing into uncomfortable territory. Basic social skills, really, but after 6 years with Daniel, who'd gradually stopped seeing me as worth his full attention, the simple act of being truly noticed felt remarkable. Sophia exaggerates, I said, accepting the champagne flute he offered from a passing waiter. I'm just helping them translate their vision for a different market. Translation is an art form, he replied, especially when you're translating not just language but entire cultural contexts. That's sophisticated work. The conversation flowed from there with an ease that surprised me. Alex, he insisted, was visiting Milan for the conference but lived in Boston, just 20 minutes from my neighborhood. He'd started his tech company 5 years ago, focusing on sustainable energy solutions for urban environments. He was passionate about his work, but talked about it with humor rather than the self-importance I'd grown accustomed to in my professional circles. More importantly, he asked questions. Real questions about my work, my thoughts on international marketing trends, my impressions of Milan. And when I answered, he listened with the kind of attention that made me feel witty and interesting and worth talking to. We ended up on the terrace as the party wound down, overlooking the cathedral illuminated against the night sky. The conversation had moved from professional to personal, covering travel, books, the peculiar challenges of rebuilding your life in your 30s. Can I ask you something? He said as we watched couples stroll through the piazza below. Are you here alone by choice, or are you between relationships? It was a direct question, but asked with enough gentleness that it didn't feel invasive. Recently divorced, I said, surprised by how easily the words came out. Still figuring out what comes next. He nodded thoughtfully. Divorce is like surgery, necessary sometimes, but it takes time to heal properly. Sounds like you speak from experience. 5 years ago, different circumstances, but I remember the feeling of having to relearn who you are when you're not half of something anymore. He turned to look at me directly. For what it's worth, you seem to be figuring it out pretty well. There was something about the way he said it. Not as a line or a compliment designed to get a reaction, but as an observation from someone who understood the process, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. We talked until the party ended and the palazzo staff began politely suggesting guests make their way to the exits. Alex walked me to the taxi line, and as we waited, he asked the question I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow night? I know a place that does incredible risotto, and I'd like to continue this conversation when we don't have to compete with champagne and networking for attention. I said yes before I could overthink it, and his smile in response was worth every moment of anxiety about dating again. Dinner led to a walking tour of the city. The walking tour led to a coffee date the following morning. Coffee led to a day spent exploring museums and markets, talking about everything and nothing, with the kind of easy intimacy that usually takes months to develop. By the time my flight back to Boston arrived, we'd exchanged contact information and made plans to see each other the following weekend. As the plane took off and Milan disappeared beneath the clouds, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Anticipation for what came next. Alex didn't disappoint. Our first official date in Boston was dinner at a small French restaurant in the North End, followed by a walk along the harbor. He picked me up at my door with flowers, not roses, which would have felt too formal, but a small bouquet of peonies because he'd remembered me mentioning they were my favorites during our conversations in Milan. The evening confirmed what I'd suspected. Alex was different from every man I'd dated, including Daniel. He was successful but not arrogant about it, confident but not self-centered. Most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, not as an accessory to his life or a project to be improved. Our second date was a cooking class. Our third was a jazz concert. Our fourth was a hiking trip in New Hampshire where we got caught in the rain and spent an hour laughing in his car while waiting for the storm to pass. By our fifth date, I realized I was falling for him in a way that felt entirely different from my relationship with Daniel. This wasn't the desperate, clinging attachment of someone afraid to be alone. This was the steady, building attraction of someone who'd learned to be happy on her own and was choosing to share that happiness with someone else. Alex made it clear he felt the same way. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the small consistencies that matter more. remembering details about my work, checking in when I mentioned being stressed about a project, planning dates around things I'd mentioned enjoying rather than things he wanted to do. 3 months into our relationship, he brought up something that made me realize how seriously he was taking us. "I've been thinking about planning a trip," he said over dinner at his apartment. "Somewhere we've both never been. Maybe Greece? I've always wanted to see the islands, and you mentioned loving Mediterranean food." The casual use of "we" in reference to future plans shouldn't have been revolutionary, but after years with Daniel, who'd gradually stopped including me in his mental picture of what came next, it felt like a revelation. "That sounds perfect," I said, and meant it. "Good, because I already started researching flights for next month. I was hoping you'd say yes." 6 months after Milan, Alex and I were inseparable in the way that feels natural rather than obsessive. We had our own lives, our own friends, our own interests, but we'd also begun building something together that felt solid and sustainable and real. I was happier than I'd been in years, maybe ever. The woman I'd become, stronger, more confident, more independent, fit perfectly with the man Alex was. We challenged each other without trying to change each other. We supported each other's goals without losing ourselves in the relationship. It was everything my marriage to Daniel hadn't been, and the contrast made me grateful for the heartbreak that had led me here. I thought about Daniel sometimes, but not with pain or longing. More like curiosity about a chapter of my life that felt increasingly distant. Through mutual friends and social media glimpses, I knew he and Jessica were living their carefully curated life in a downtown loft. They attended gallery openings and charity galas, posted photos from expensive restaurants, and seemed to be building the kind of relationship that looked perfect from the outside. I didn't wish them ill, I genuinely didn't. But I also didn't miss being part of that performance, the constant pressure to present the right image and say the right things and be the right kind of partner for someone who was always evaluating whether you were enough. With Alex, I never questioned whether I was enough. I was exactly who I was, and that was not only acceptable but celebrated. One evening in late autumn, as we were walking through Boston Common after dinner, Alex stopped by the pond and turned to face me. "I have something I want to tell you," he said, his expression more serious than usual. My heart did a small flip, the way it always did when conversations took unexpected turns. "Okay. I love you, Claire, not just because you're beautiful or smart or funny, though you're all of those things. I love who you are when you think no one's watching. I love how you throw yourself into everything you care about. I love that you rebuilt your entire life instead of just surviving it. I love that you're brave enough to start over." The words hit me with a force I hadn't expected. Not because they were surprising, we'd been building toward this moment for months, but because they felt so completely true. Alex didn't love an idealized version of me, or a version he hoped I'd become. He loved the actual person I was, including the scars and the strength that had grown around them. "I love you too," I said, and it felt like the most honest thing I'd said in years. He kissed me under the streetlights with the kind of sweetness that made me remember why people wrote songs about moments like this. When we broke apart, he was smiling in a way that made my chest feel warm and tight. "Good," he said, "because I was hoping you'd want to move in with me. We'd been spending most nights together anyway, switching between his penthouse apartment and my house depending on our schedules. But the invitation felt like more than a practical arrangement. It felt like a declaration that what we were building was worth making official." "Are you sure?" I asked, though I already knew my answer. "It's a big step." "I'm sure. Are you?" I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, so dependent on Daniel's approval that losing it had nearly destroyed me. Then I thought about the woman I was now, standing in the middle of Boston Common, with a man who loved me for who I actually was, not who he needed me to be. "I'm sure," I said. Moving in with Alex felt different from every other relationship milestone I'd experienced. There was no anxiety about whether I was making the right choice, no need to negotiate who I would be in this new configuration. I was simply bringing my fully formed self into a space we'd share together. His penthouse was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, modern furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, a kitchen that was clearly designed by someone who actually cooked. But what made it feel like home was how naturally I fit into it, how easily our routines merged and our belongings found places alongside each other. We were happy, genuinely uncomplicated happy in a way that felt both precious and permanent. Alex's business was thriving, my consulting practice was busier than I could handle, and we were making plans that extended months and years into the future. Which is why when the envelope arrived on that Thursday morning in early spring, it felt like a message from a different lifetime. Chapter 5. The Invitation. The envelope was tucked between a stack of work documents and a package I'd ordered from Paris. A silk scarf I'd bought on impulse during a video call with a client, thinking it would be perfect for an upcoming presentation. I almost tossed the envelope aside without looking, assuming it was just another piece of junk mail that had somehow escaped our building's excellent filtering system. But the handwriting stopped me cold. Daniel's handwriting. Slightly slanted, all caps for the recipient's name. The same penmanship that had once addressed birthday cards and anniversary notes, and grocery lists stuck to our refrigerator. My name looked strange written in his familiar script, like a word in a foreign language that I almost but not quite remembered. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened. Whatever Daniel Harris had to say to me after nearly 2 years of silence couldn't possibly be worth the emotional disruption of reading it. I'd worked too hard to build my new life to let him back in, even in letter form. But curiosity is a persistent thing, and after 10 minutes of staring at the envelope while drinking my morning coffee, I gave in to it. Inside was a heavy cream card embossed in gold, the kind of wedding invitation that screamed money and careful planning. The formal script announced the upcoming marriage of Daniel Harris and Jessica Reed at a vineyard estate outside Cape Cod. The date was 2 months away. The time was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The dress code was formal. Code was at the bottom, and Daniel's handwriting was a note that made my jaw clench involuntarily. Thought you might want to see how it's done right, D. I read the note 3 times, each reading making me angrier than the last. This wasn't just an invitation. This was a calculated insult, a deliberate attempt to wound me with the implication that our marriage had somehow been deficient, that his new relationship represented an upgrade from the life we'd shared. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. The assumption that I would care enough about his new marriage to feel diminished by it. The belief that he still had the power to hurt me, that his opinion of our past still mattered enough to shape how I felt about my present. I set the invitation on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Anger, obviously, disbelief at his audacity. But underneath those familiar reactions was something else, something I hadn't expected. Amusement. 2 years ago, an invitation like this would have destroyed me. The cruel little note would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt and depression, questioning everything about my worth and our marriage, and my ability to inspire the kind of love that Daniel apparently felt for Jessica. Now, reading his petty attempt at psychological warfare, I felt something closer to pity. This was what Daniel thought would hurt me? This pathetic bid for relevance in my life? He'd moved on, found someone new, was building what he presumably considered a better relationship, and yet he was still so invested in my reaction that he'd gone out of his way to invite me to witness his happiness. It said everything about where he was emotionally and nothing flattering. When Alex came home that evening, he found me curled on the sofa with the invitation balanced on the coffee table, like evidence in a criminal case. "Who's getting married?" he asked, loosening his tie with the casual elegance that never failed to make my pulse quicken slightly. "Daniel and Jessica," I said, watching his face carefully. Alex picked up the invitation, read the formal announcement, then flipped it over to see the handwritten note. His eyebrow rose incrementally as he processed Daniel's message. "And he sent this to you because he wants me to see how superior his new relationship is to our marriage. Because he thinks I'm sitting around somewhere pining for what we had and comparing every aspect of my life unfavorably to his upgraded version." Alex set the invitation back down and sat beside me, his expression thoughtful. "And how do you feel about that?" It was such a perfectly Alex question. Direct but not leading, genuinely curious about my emotional state rather than trying to steer me toward a particular reaction. It was one of the things I loved most about him, the way he trusted me to know my own mind and simply wanted to understand what I was thinking. Honestly, I feel sorry for him. Alex's mouth curved into a slight smile. Sorry for him. Think about it. He's marrying someone he supposedly loves, planning what should be the happiest day of his life. And he's so preoccupied with my potential reaction that he took time to craft a deliberately hurtful invitation. That's not the behavior of a man who's genuinely happy. That's the behavior of someone who's still fighting battles from his last relationship. Alex studied me for a moment, and I could see him processing not just my words, but my tone, my body language, my overall demeanor. After almost a year together, he'd become excellent at reading my emotional weather patterns. "You're not upset," he said, and it wasn't a question. I'm not upset. I'm liberated, I think, because this proved something I've been hoping was true but wasn't entirely sure of. I really have moved on, completely. The woman who married Daniel Harris cared desperately about his opinion and would have been devastated by something like this. The woman I am now finds it kind of pathetic. Alex reached over and took my hand, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in the absent way he did when he was thinking. "So, what do you want to do about it?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you want to ignore it? Send a polite decline, or—" He paused, and his smile became more pronounced. "Do you want to show up and demonstrate exactly how wrong his assumptions about you are?" The suggestion hung in the air between us, dangerous and tempting. The idea of attending Daniel's wedding hadn't even occurred to me, but now that Alex had voiced it, I could feel something shifting in my chest. Not anger or a desire for revenge, but something cooler and more deliberate. "You think I should go?" I asked. "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But if you want my opinion, I think watching you walk into that wedding would be the best education Daniel Harris ever received about the difference between the woman he left and the woman he lost." There was something in Alex's voice when he said it, a quiet confidence that made me feel powerful in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. He wasn't suggesting I go to prove anything to Daniel, or to get revenge, or to cause drama. He was suggesting I go because I had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of, because my presence alone would tell a story that no amount of explanation could communicate. "Would you come with me?" I asked. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. That night, we talked through the logistics and implications of actually attending Daniel's wedding. It would mean spending money on formal wear we'd never use again. It would mean a weekend trip to Cape Cod and potential awkwardness with mutual friends who would be there. It would mean facing Jessica in person for the first time since learning about their relationship. But as we discussed the practical considerations, I realized that none of them worried me. The woman I'd become could handle awkward conversations and curious stares, and whatever passive-aggressive behavior Daniel might exhibit. More than that, she was curious about whether attending would provide any useful closure, any final punctuation mark on that chapter of her life. "Are you sure this isn't about proving something to him?" Alex asked as we were getting ready for bed. "Because you don't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all your ex-husband." It was exactly the right question, the one that forced me to examine my motivations, honestly. Was this about showing Daniel what he'd lost? About demonstrating my superior happiness? About getting some kind of psychological revenge? "I don't think so," I said after considering it carefully. "I think it's about showing myself something. About testing whether I really am as over all of this as I think I am. If I can walk into that wedding and feel nothing but mild curiosity about these people who used to matter to me, then I'll know for certain that I've finished processing this part of my life." Alex nodded, satisfied with my answer. "Then we should definitely go, but we're going to need appropriate outfits." The next weekend, we drove to New York for what Alex called tactical shopping. We spent Saturday morning at a high-end tailor where Alex was measured for a midnight black tuxedo that made him look like he'd stepped off the cover of a men's magazine. The cut was perfect, emphasizing his height and the breadth of his shoulders while maintaining the kind of understated elegance that suggested confidence rather than ostentation. While he was being fitted, I wandered through the women's section of the store, running my fingers over fabrics and silhouettes that were far more luxurious than anything I'd owned during my marriage to Daniel. That's when I found it, a champagne silk gown that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was fitted at the waist with a subtle shimmer that caught the light like water at sunset. The neckline was daring but sophisticated, the kind of cut that suggested confidence without crossing into inappropriate territory. The train was long enough to create an elegant line, but not so dramatic that it would be difficult to manage. I slipped into it in the fitting room and turned toward the mirror. The woman staring back at me didn't look like someone's ex-wife. She looked like someone who wrote her own story, someone who had places to be and people to impress, not because she needed their approval, but because she enjoyed the theater of looking spectacular. When I stepped out of the fitting room, Alex's expression told me everything I needed to know. He went very still for a moment, his eyes traveling from the neckline to the way the silk moved when I walked. "That's the one," he said softly. The dress was expensive, more than I'd ever spent on a single piece of clothing, but I bought it without hesitation. This wasn't just about Daniel's wedding anymore. This was about owning my transformation, about having clothes that matched the person I'd become. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I found myself anticipating the event with a mixture of excitement and curiosity that surprised me. I wasn't nervous about seeing Daniel or Jessica. I wasn't worried about how I'd be received by mutual friends. I was simply looking forward to the moment when I'd walk into that room and close the door on that chapter of my life definitively. Emily was beside herself with delight when I told her about our plans. "Oh, this is going to be delicious," she said over lunch, practically bouncing in her chair. "Promise me you'll take pictures." "Actually, never mind pictures. I want a full report with every detail about their faces when you walk in." "I'm not going there to humiliate anyone," I protested. "I just want to attend, make an appearance, and move on with my life." "Claire, honey, you don't have to try to humiliate them. Just showing up looking like you do now, happy and successful and clearly thriving, will accomplish that all by itself. Daniel invited you because he thought you'd be too intimidated or too broken to actually show up. He has no idea what's about to walk through those doors. 2 nights before the wedding, Alex took me to dinner at a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking the harbor. The city glowed beneath us, and the air was just cool enough for me to wrap his jacket around my shoulders. The setting was romantic, but there was something in Alex's manner that suggested this wasn't just a casual date night. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" he asked after we'd ordered. I shook my head. "Not even a little. I'm looking forward to it, actually. I want to walk in, make the point, and walk out. Clean and simple." Alex reached across the table and took my hand. "Good. Because I have something I want to give you tonight, something I was planning to save for a different occasion. But this feels like the right moment." My heart skipped as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. For a moment, I thought he was about to propose, and I felt a flutter of panic about the timing. But when he opened the box, instead of an engagement ring, there was a delicate gold bracelet with a single charm, a small phoenix. "I saw this last week and couldn't stop thinking about you," he said, fastening it around my wrist. "Because that's what you are, Claire. You didn't just survive what happened to you, you rose from it completely transformed, stronger and more beautiful than before." The symbolism was perfect, but what moved me most was that Alex had been thinking about my journey, about what I'd overcome and who I'd become, even when we weren't talking about it. That he saw my transformation not as something to be pitied or fixed, but as something to be celebrated. "It's perfect," I said, touching the small charm. "Thank you. Tomorrow, when you walk into that wedding, I want you to remember that you're not the woman Daniel left behind. You're the woman who built herself back up from nothing and created a life better than anything she had before. And I want everyone in that room to see exactly what he lost." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming across the bed and the sound of Alex making coffee in the kitchen. My gown hung in its garment bag by the closet, Alex's tuxedo beside it. In a few hours, we'd be stepping into a scene Daniel thought he controlled. He had no idea we were about to rewrite it entirely. Chapter 6. The Arrival. The drive to Cape Cod felt like the prelude to a film, the kind where you know the best scene is waiting just beyond the next turn. The morning was perfect. Clear skies, gentle breeze, the kind of late spring day that makes you understand why people write poetry about New England. Alex was at the wheel of the Rolls-Royce Phantom he'd arranged for the occasion, its polished black surface reflecting the world like a dark mirror. The choice of car wasn't about showing off, though it certainly made a statement. It was about creating the right atmosphere, the sense that we were arriving not as guests who hoped to be welcomed, but as people who belonged wherever we chose to be. We weren't rushing. We had deliberately planned to arrive not fashionably late, but perfectly timed. After the initial greetings and small talk had settled into comfortable rhythms, when our entrance would create the maximum impact without appearing calculated. Inside the car, everything was quiet but charged. My gown lay across my lap in a sweep of champagne silk, the fabric cool against my skin through the tissue paper that protected it. Alex had changed into his tuxedo at the hotel, and seeing him in formal wear never failed to remind me why heads turned when we entered rooms together. He looked like old money and new power combined, the kind of man who could command attention without raising his voice. "Ready?" he asked, glancing over at me as we turned onto the coastal road that would take us to the vineyard estate. I smiled, feeling calmer than I had any right to be. "More than ready." The truth was, I'd been ready for this moment longer than I'd realized. Not because I wanted confrontation or drama, but because I'd been building toward it for 2 years without knowing it. Every morning workout, every late night studying for my certification, every small victory that had rebuilt my confidence. They'd all been preparing me for this test of who I'd become. The vineyard estate came into view like something out of a luxury magazine spread. Rolling green fields stretched toward the ocean, punctuated by carefully manicured gardens and whitewashed buildings that had been converted into elegant event spaces. Even from a distance, I could see the evidence of Daniel's typical approach to important occasions. Spare no expense, invite everyone who mattered, create an experience that would be remembered and discussed for months afterward. There were already dozens of cars in the valet area, overseen by staff in crisp Navy uniforms. Through the open doors of the main reception hall, I could hear the low hum of conversation and classical music, the sounds of a celebration in full swing. We pulled up to the entrance just as a small group of guests was arriving in a modest sedan. Their animated chatter faltered when they saw our car glide to a stop, the phantom's presence somehow changing the energy of the moment. One of the women leaned toward her companion, whispering behind a manicured hand while keeping her eyes fixed on our tinted windows. I kept my breathing slow and steady, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to savor this moment. After months of anticipation, we were finally here. In a few minutes, I would step out of this car and into a room where Daniel Harris was celebrating what he believed to be his upgrade from our marriage. He was about to discover how wrong he'd been about everything. A valet in a navy jacket stepped forward to open Alex's door. Alex emerged with an easy grace, buttoning his tuxedo jacket with the kind of casual elegance that suggested this was just another evening for him. He was tall enough and confident enough that his presence immediately commanded attention, even from people who had no idea who he was. As he moved around to my side of the car, I could see faces turning toward us through the windows of the reception hall. Cameras and phones were already being lifted, guests positioning themselves for better views of whatever was about to happen. Through the open doors, I caught fragments of conversation and laughter from inside. Jessica's voice, bright but with an edge of forced enthusiasm that suggested she was working harder than she wanted to be to keep things running smoothly. Daniel's laugh, pitched slightly too high in the way that meant he was networking rather than genuinely enjoying himself. They had no idea we were only steps away. Alex opened my door and offered his hand, but I didn't move immediately. For just a moment, I sat in the back seat of the Rolls-Royce and looked at the man I loved. Really looked at him. Tall, composed, wearing formal wear like he'd been born to it. But more than that, he was looking at me with an expression of such complete admiration and support that I felt my chest tighten with emotion. This wasn't just my partner for the evening, this was my partner in life. The person who had seen me at my lowest point and chosen to love me not despite my scars, but because of the strength I'd developed healing them. Whatever happened in the next hour, I would be walking in there with someone who made me feel worthy of being loved exactly as I was. I took his hand and stepped out onto the stone path. The effect was immediate and electric. The sunlight caught my gown instantly, making the champagne silk shimmer like liquid gold. The train pooled behind me in a perfect line, and every step I took created subtle movements in the fabric that caught the light like water at sunset. I had styled my hair in the soft Hollywood waves that moved gently in the ocean breeze, and the Phoenix bracelet Alex had given me caught the afternoon sun as I adjusted my small clutch. I didn't need to look around to know we had captured the complete attention of everyone within sight. I could feel it in the sudden silence, the way conversations paused mid-sentence, the shift in energy that happens when something worth watching enters a space. Alex offered me his arm and we began walking slowly toward the entrance. Our footsteps on the stone path somehow sounded louder than the music coming from inside the reception hall. Each click of my heels was measured and deliberate, not hurried but not hesitant either. We moved like people who had every right to be there, like people who enhanced any room they entered simply by being themselves. The whispers started before we reached the doors. Is that? Oh my God, she looks. Who is he? I can't believe she actually came. I didn't acknowledge the murmurs or turn to look at the faces I could feel watching us. This wasn't about performing for an audience. This was about walking into a space where I'd once been defined by someone else's narrative and proving, without saying a word, that I'd outgrown the entire story. At the entrance, a coordinator with a clipboard and a professional smile paused mid-conversation when she saw us. Her expression went from routine welcome to something approaching awe as she took in Alex's commanding presence and my gown, which was clearly several levels above anything else she'd seen that day. "Welcome," she said, her voice tilting up into a question as she struggled to place us in whatever mental guest list she'd been maintaining. Alex gave her a polite nod, his voice warm but authoritative. "Thank you. We're here for Daniel Harris's wedding." Something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or the shock of connecting my name on the guest list to the reality standing in front of her. She glanced at her clipboard, then back at us, clearly trying to process the gap between whatever she'd been expecting and what had actually arrived. "Of course," she said, stepping aside quickly. "Please, go right in." The moment we crossed the threshold, I felt the atmosphere change. The reception hall was awash of white flowers and twinkling lights, tables draped in expensive linen surrounding a central dance floor, where Jessica was greeting a cluster of elderly relatives. Her wedding gown was beautiful, no denying that. But as I took in the scene, I realized that nothing about it felt particularly personal or meaningful. It was perfectly executed and utterly generic, the kind of wedding that could have belonged to anyone with enough money to hire the right vendors. Jessica was in the middle of laughing at something one of the relatives had said when the first whispers reached her. I watched her expression change as she caught sight of us, the polite smile freezing on her face as she processed what she was seeing. Across the room, Daniel was standing at the bar with a group of men I recognized from his office. He was in the middle of telling some story, gesturing with his champagne flute in the animated way that meant he was holding court. But something in the shift of attention around the room made him pause and turn to see what had captured everyone's focus. The moment his eyes found me, his face went through a series of changes so rapid they were almost comical. Surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like fear as he took in, not just my presence, but my transformation. This wasn't the broken woman he'd left behind. This wasn't even the woman he'd known during our marriage. This was someone entirely new, someone who moved through the world with a confidence and grace that made it clear she wasn't seeking anyone's approval or permission to exist. I didn't speed up or slow down as we moved through the crowd. Alex and I maintained the same measured pace, allowing conversations to dip into silence as guests turned to watch us pass. Every step was deliberate, not for show but for control. This wasn't about storming in or making a scene. This was about arriving like we belonged there, more than belonged there, like our presence elevated the entire event. When we reached the edge of the dance floor, I glanced at Jessica. Her smile was still in place, but her eyes had gone sharp and calculating as she tried to assess what our presence meant for her perfect day. She turned slightly toward Daniel, her hand brushing his arm in a subtle attempt to ground him, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty she couldn't quite mask. Alex leaned in just enough for me to hear him over the music. "They're already unraveling." I gave the smallest smile, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over me like expensive perfume. "We're just getting started." The music swelled for a moment, as if the band sensed something significant was happening and wanted to provide an appropriate soundtrack. Guests shifted in their seats and adjusted their positions for better views. Phones appeared in hands with the speed of muscle memory, everyone wanting to document whatever was about to unfold. My heartbeat was steady, my breathing calm. I felt none of the anxiety or vindictiveness I might have expected. Instead, there was only a serene certainty that this moment belonged to me as much as it belonged to Daniel and Jessica. They had invited me to witness their happiness, and I was about to show them exactly what they had lost when they decided I wasn't worth keeping. The storm they'd been expecting was standing right in front of them. They just hadn't realized it yet. Chapter 7. The Encounter. Alex and I moved through the reception like we owned the space, which in a way we did. Confidence has a way of creating its own gravity, drawing attention and parting crowds without any conscious effort. The light from the crystal chandeliers caught my gown with every step, sending ripples of champagne-colored light across the floor. Daniel stood frozen near the bar, one hand gripping a champagne flute he'd apparently forgotten to drink from. His eyes kept flicking between Alex and me, and I could see him trying to process not just my presence, but my transformation. The last time he'd seen me, I'd been the shell of the woman he'd married. Tired, defeated, clinging to the remnants of a relationship that had already ended in his mind. The woman standing before him now bore no resemblance to that person. Alex broke the silence first, and his approach was masterful. Instead of addressing Daniel directly, he turned to the nearest cluster of guests with the perfect balance of charm and volume to ensure his words carried across the immediate area. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexander Bennett, and this is my fiancée, Claire Morgan." The word fiancé landed in the room like a champagne flute dropped on marble. Audible gasps slipped out from multiple directions. Someone at the back of the room whispered, "Claire Morgan?" As in, oh, and didn't finish the sentence because everyone understood the implication. I felt Alex's use of the word rather than heard it, the way you feel a thunderclap in your chest before your ears process the sound. We hadn't discussed it beforehand, hadn't planned this particular revelation, but the timing was perfect. He wasn't proposing to make a point at Daniel's wedding. We'd been talking about engagement for weeks. He was simply choosing this moment to make our commitment public, and the effect was devastating in the best possible way. Jessica's smile twitched. It was such a slight movement that most people would miss it, but I'd spent enough time studying social dynamics to recognize the microfracture. Her perfect composure was developing cracks, and we'd been in the room for less than 5 minutes. Daniel still hadn't moved. His knuckles were white around his champagne flute, and I half wondered if the glass might actually shatter from the pressure. Alex continued with the kind of casual confidence that made his words impossible to dismiss or diminish. "We're actually flying to Paris next week for our engagement party, but when we received Daniel's thoughtful invitation, we couldn't resist coming to wish them well in person. It was a masterclass in social warfare disguised as perfect etiquette. Every word was technically polite and completely appropriate, but the subtext was clear to everyone in the room. We had received the invitation, chosen to attend despite our exciting lives and international travel plans, and we were graciously acknowledging their occasion before returning to our obviously superior existence." I remained silent, and the silence was part of the theater. Every glance, every shimmer of my gown, every subtle exchange between Alex and me told the story without words. I could feel eyes on us from every direction, people weighing the difference between the woman Daniel had divorced and the woman standing here now. Finally, Jessica stepped forward, her voice warm but brittle around the edges. "Claire, how lovely of you to come." I met her gaze evenly, allowing a small smile to touch my lips. "Thank you, Jessica. You look beautiful." She blinked, clearly unsure whether to accept the compliment or search it for hidden meaning. I left it hanging in the air, turning my attention to examine the elaborate floral arrangements nearby. Let her wonder whether I was being sincere or subtly condescending. Either interpretation would serve our purposes. Daniel finally set down his glass and moved closer, the polite smile on his face not quite reaching his eyes. There was something almost desperate in his expression, like a man trying to regain control of a conversation that had slipped away from him entirely. "Claire," he said, his tone somewhere between surprise and an attempt at authority. "This is unexpected." "Life's full of surprises," I replied lightly, my voice carrying just enough warmth to be polite and just enough distance to be devastating. "I hear congratulations are in order." For a moment, the room was so quiet I could hear the gentle clink of cutlery from the catering staff preparing for dinner service. Then someone in the crowd coughed, and conversations resumed. Not because the tension had eased, but because people were eager to discuss what they were witnessing in whispered tones. Alex ordered champagne for both of us from a passing waiter, and we positioned ourselves near the center of the reception area, where we would be visible to the maximum number of guests. It wasn't calculated positioning, we genuinely wanted to observe the party and interact with people we knew. But the effect was that our presence became impossible to ignore. Every few minutes, someone would approach us. Old friends who hadn't seen me since the divorce, colleagues from Daniel's office who were curious about my transformation, acquaintances who wanted to be part of whatever drama they sensed was unfolding. Alex handled each interaction with the kind of effortless charm that made people feel important while subtly establishing our social status. "Claire looks incredible, doesn't she?" he'd say to someone who asked how I was doing. "She's been absolutely thriving since she started her consulting business. I'm constantly amazed by her success." Or, "We're so excited about Paris. Claire has clients all over Europe now, so we're making it a working vacation. She's become quite the international consultant." None of it was boastful or inappropriate. He was simply a proud partner sharing his admiration for my accomplishments. But in the context of Daniel's wedding, where the implicit message was supposed to be that he'd upgraded to something better, Alex's words created a counter-narrative that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, I could see Daniel's composure continuing to deteriorate. His glances in our direction became more frequent and less subtle. His conversations with other guests seemed forced, his laughter too loud. At one point, I caught him staring openly at Alex, clearly trying to assess who this man was and how he'd managed to capture the attention of the woman Daniel had so casually discarded. Jessica, to her credit, was handling the situation better than her new husband. She moved through the reception with practiced grace, playing the perfect bride and hostess. But I noticed she avoided our section of the room, choosing to greet guests and take photos in areas where she wouldn't have to interact with us directly. About 30 minutes into our visit, something happened that crystallized the entire dynamic. A photographer who'd been documenting the reception approached us and asked if we'd mind being included in some candid shots of the guests. Before we could respond, he was snapping photos of Alex and me together. Me adjusting his boutonniere, him whispering something in my ear that made me laugh, both of us looking like we'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. From across the room, I saw Daniel watching the photo session with an expression I couldn't quite read. But Jessica's reaction was unmistakable. Her smile faltered completely for just a moment, and she turned away sharply, her hand pressed to her temple like she was developing a headache. The photos would be part of their wedding album forever. Every time they looked back at their special day, they'd see images of Alex and me looking radiant and deeply in love. A visual reminder that their wedding had become the stage for someone else's happiness. As we mingled with the other guests, I began to understand something that hadn't been clear from the outside. This wedding was beautiful, but it wasn't particularly joyful. The conversations were polite, but surface level. The laughter felt performative. Even the toasts, when they began, had the hollow ring of people saying what was expected rather than what was felt. It was the kind of wedding that prioritized appearance over substance, which made perfect sense given what I now knew about Daniel and Jessica's relationship. They'd built something that looked impressive from the outside, but lacked the foundation of genuine partnership that makes celebrations feel authentic. The contrast with Alex and my relationship was stark. We hadn't needed an elaborate venue or expensive flowers to feel connected. Our love was evident in small gestures. The way he automatically adjusted his pace to match mine, how I straightened his pocket square without thinking about it, the looks we exchanged that conveyed entire conversations. Several people commented on how happy we looked together. "You two seem so natural," one of Daniel's aunts told us. "It's lovely to see a couple who actually enjoys each other's company." The comment wasn't meant as a comparison to the bride and groom, but in context, it felt like one. About 45 minutes into our visit, I realized we'd accomplished everything we'd come to do. We'd made our appearance, demonstrated my transformation, and shown everyone in the room that Daniel's assumptions about my life after our divorce had been spectacularly wrong. The longer we stayed, the more we risked crossing the line from making a point to creating actual drama. I caught Alex's eye and gave him the slightest nod. He understood immediately. "Should we make our exit?" he asked quietly. "I think that would be perfect." Alex finished his champagne and set the glass on a nearby table. Then he turned toward the center of the room, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the people closest to us. "We should probably let you get back to your celebration. he said in Daniel and Jessica's general direction. We have dinner reservations in town and we don't want to overstay our welcome. It was the perfect exit line. Polite, considerate, and casually implying that we had our own plans and our own lives that were calling us away from their event. Daniel stepped forward, and for a moment, I thought he might try to say something significant, make some kind of gesture toward reconciliation or explanation. But whatever words he'd been considering seemed to die in his throat as he looked at me. Up close, the change in my appearance was even more dramatic. The woman he'd left behind had been diminished by heartbreak. The woman standing before him now radiated a confidence and contentment that made it clear she'd not only survived his departure, but thrived because of it. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining social niceties when what he really wanted was to understand how everything had gone so wrong. "Of course," I replied. "Best wishes to both of you." Alex offered his hand to Daniel for a polite handshake. "Congratulations, you have a beautiful wedding." As we walked toward the exit, I felt the same parting of the crowd that had marked our entrance. People stepped aside, conversations paused, cameras followed our movement. But this time, instead of curiosity about what we might do, there was a sense of having witnessed something significant. At the doorway, Alex paused and turned back toward the room, with the kind of gracious gesture that suggested we were reluctant to leave such a lovely party. "Thank you for your hospitality," he called out, his words directed toward Daniel and Jessica, but spoken loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "We'll let you get back to your celebration." It was the perfect closing line, grateful but not effusive, polite but not overly warm. We weren't fleeing or making a dramatic exit. We were simply people who had other places to be and better things to do. As we stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around us like an embrace. The Rolls-Royce was waiting exactly where we'd left it, the driver standing ready to open our doors. Before I got into the car, I took one last glance back at the reception hall. Through the wide windows, I could see Daniel still standing near where we'd left him, staring at the space we'd just vacated. Jessica was at his side, speaking quickly and urgently, her composure finally cracking as she realized what had just happened to her perfect wedding day. They'd invited me to witness their happiness, expecting me to provide a stark contrast that would highlight their success. Instead, they'd given me the perfect stage to demonstrate that their version of happiness was a pale imitation of what I'd built for myself. I slid into the backseat of the Rolls-Royce, the champagne silk of my gown pooling around me like liquid gold. Alex joined me, and as the car began to move, he reached for my hand. "How do you feel?" he asked. I considered the question as we drove away from the Vineyard estate, leaving Daniel and Jessica to salvage what remained of their wedding reception. How did I feel? "Complete," I said finally. Like I just closed the last page of a book I'd been meaning to finish for 2 years. Alex smiled and brought my hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles just above the Phoenix bracelet. "Good. Because that wasn't about them, Claire. That was about you proving to yourself that you've moved beyond their ability to touch your happiness." He was right. This hadn't been about revenge or humiliation or proving anything to Daniel and Jessica. This had been about testing the strength of the foundation I'd built for my new life and finding it solid enough to withstand any storm. We hadn't been on the road for more than 10 minutes when my phone started buzzing. Text messages, missed calls, notifications from social media platforms where people had apparently already posted photos from the reception. The digital aftermath was beginning, but I didn't feel compelled to check any of it. Whatever people were saying about our appearance, whatever theories they were developing about our motivations, whatever drama they were creating from the raw material we'd provided, none of it mattered. The only opinion that had ever mattered was my own, and I was proud of the woman I'd become. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The first text came through before we'd even reached the main road. My phone buzzed against my clutch with the insistence of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Alex and I exchanged a knowing look as I pulled the device out, both of us understanding that the digital aftermath of our appearance was about to begin. The message was from Emily, and it was exactly what I'd expected. "Claire Morgan, you absolute legend. Sarah Jenkins was at that wedding, and she says you looked like a movie star. Also, your mystery man is apparently gorgeous and rich. I'm dying for details." I showed Alex the message, and he chuckled softly. Word travels fast. Small social circles, I replied, silencing my phone before sliding it back into my clutch. I'll deal with the fallout later. Right now, I just want to enjoy this. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, the Rolls-Royce gliding along the coastal highway as the sun began to set over Cape Cod Bay. The day had been perfect in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had needed to. Our simple presence had been enough to rewrite the entire narrative Daniel thought he'd been controlling. About 20 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, and Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Alex glanced at the display and raised an eyebrow. Want to take it? I considered for a moment, then shook my head. Not yet. Let him think about what he wants to say first. The call went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, another call. Then a text. Claire, can we talk, please? The word please made me smile. This from the man who had once told me I'd never find anyone better, who had left me with such casual cruelty that I'd questioned my worth for months afterward. Now he was using please like a magic word that might undo the reality of what he'd witnessed. I let the messages accumulate unread for the rest of the drive. By the time we reached our hotel, a boutique property overlooking the harbor where Alex had booked us a suite for the night, there were 6 missed calls and 4 text messages from Daniel, plus a growing collection of notifications from friends and acquaintances who'd apparently heard about our appearance through various channels. You've created quite a stir, Alex said as we rode the elevator to our floor. We've created quite a stir, I corrected. This was a team effort. In our suite, Alex helped me out of my gown with the reverent care of someone handling museum pieces. The champagne silk pooled on the bed like captured starlight, and I found myself thinking that it had served its purpose perfectly. I'd never need to wear it again, but I'd always remember how it felt to move through that reception hall in fabric that made me feel invincible. While Alex called room service to order dinner, I finally checked my phone. The messages from Daniel had progressed from polite request to something approaching desperation. Claire, I shouldn't have invited you. That was a mistake. You didn't have to show up like that. I made a mistake letting you go. Seeing you today, I realized what I lost. If there's any part of you that still cares, we should talk. The evolution was fascinating to watch. In the space of a few hours, he'd gone from the confident man who'd sent a cruel invitation to someone grappling with the reality that his assumptions about my life had been completely wrong. But what struck me most wasn't his regret. It was how little it affected me. 2 years ago, messages like these would have sent me into an emotional tailspin. I would have analyzed every word for hidden meaning, wondered if his regret was genuine, fantasized about what it might mean for our future. Now, reading his increasingly frantic texts, I felt nothing but a mild curiosity about what had prompted this sudden reversal. His regret wasn't about love or loss or recognizing what we'd had together. It was about losing control of the narrative he'd been telling himself about our divorce. Emily called while I was deleting the message thread without reading the rest. Claire Morgan, you beautiful genius, she said before I could even say hello. I have been getting texts all evening from people who were at that wedding. They're saying you looked like Grace Kelly and your mystery man looked like James Bond. Also, apparently Jessica disappeared to the bathroom for 30 minutes after you left and came out with red eyes. Emily, no, don't you dare try to downplay this. Do you know what people are saying? They're saying Daniel looked like he'd seen a ghost, that he could barely speak after you left, that Jessica had to physically steer him away from the windows because he kept staring at where your car had been. I sank into the chair by the window, looking out at the harbor where sailboats were returning to the marina with the setting sun. It wasn't about hurting them, Em. It was about showing myself that I'd moved beyond their ability to hurt me. Well, mission accomplished on multiple levels. Also, when exactly were you planning to tell your best friend that you're engaged? Because according to Sarah Jenkins, your devastatingly handsome companion introduced you as his fiancée. I glanced at Alex, who was hanging up his tuxedo jacket and pretending not to listen to my conversation. It's complicated. Uncomplicated. Are you engaged or not? Ask me tomorrow, I said, and Emily's delighted squeal was loud enough that Alex looked over with amusement. After I hung up, Alex joined me by the window with 2 glasses of champagne from the bottle he'd ordered from room service. So, he said, settling into the chair beside mine, should I be prepared for questions about our engagement status? You started this by calling me your fiancé, I pointed out. I was just following your lead. True, but for the record, it wasn't a performance, Claire. I've been thinking about proposing for weeks. Today just felt like the right moment to make it real. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, different from the one that had held the Phoenix bracelet, but clearly from the same jeweler. I was planning to do this tonight anyway, but given that I've already announced our engagement to half of Cape Cod's social elite, I figured I should make it official. My heart did that fluttering thing it had been doing around Alex for months, but this time it was accompanied by a certainty that surprised me with its strength. This wasn't the desperate attachment I'd felt with Daniel, the need to be chosen and validated by someone else's love. This was the calm recognition that I'd found someone who enhanced my life rather than defining it. Is this your formal proposal? I asked. No, he said, standing up and moving to kneel beside my chair. This is. What followed was everything a proposal should be: personal, heartfelt, and completely focused on the future we wanted to build together, rather than the past we were leaving behind. Alex spoke about loving who I was and who I was becoming, about wanting to travel the world with me and build something that would last. He talked about the way I'd transformed my life and how watching my strength had made him want to be worthy of it. The ring was perfect. A classic solitaire setting with a diamond that caught the harbor lights like captured stars. It was elegant without being ostentatious, sophisticated without being showy. Like everything else about Alex, it was exactly right for who I was rather than who he thought I should become. Yes, I said before he'd even finished the formal question, and his smile in response was bright enough to light up the entire harbor. We spent the evening on our hotel room balcony, talking about wedding plans and honeymoon destinations and the life we'd build together. But mostly we talked about how surreal the day had been, how perfectly everything had unfolded. Do you think we went too far? I asked as we watched the last sailboat return to the marina. Do you feel like we went too far? I considered the question honestly. Had we been cruel? Had we deliberately hurt 2 people on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives? Had we crossed ethical lines in our desire to make a point? No, I said finally. We didn't cause a scene or say anything inappropriate. We just showed up and existed as the people we actually are. If that disrupted their narrative, that's not our responsibility. Alex nodded. Besides, they invited you expecting you to provide a contrast that would make their happiness look more impressive. They just didn't anticipate what that contrast would actually reveal. The next morning, we woke to a voice message from Daniel that had been left at 2:17 a.m. His voice was slurred with alcohol and thick with emotion I'd never heard from him before. Claire, I fucked up. I fucked up everything. I don't know what I thought. That you'd be broken forever? That you'd never move on? Seeing you yesterday? Seeing how happy you looked? Seeing you with him? I realized I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me for what? For Jessica? For some fantasy about what I thought I wanted? There was a long pause, filled with background noise that suggested he was calling from a bar or a restaurant. I know it's too late. I know you've moved on and you're with someone who obviously treats you the way I should have. But I needed you to know that I know I was wrong about everything, about you, about us, about what mattered. I was wrong. The message ended abruptly, and I wondered if he'd hung up deliberately or if his phone had simply died. I played it for Alex over coffee and room service breakfast, and he listened with the kind of thoughtful attention he brought to everything. How does that make you feel? He asked when it finished. Sad for him, I said, surprising myself with the honesty, but not in a way that makes me want to do anything about it. He's mourning something he threw away, but he's not mourning me. He's mourning the woman I became after he left, the life I built without him. If he'd appreciated who I was when we were together, none of this would have happened. Alex reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb brushing across the engagement ring that still felt surreal on my finger. You know what I love about you, Claire? You have every right to be bitter about what he put you through, but you've chosen growth instead. You could have used yesterday to humiliate him, but you used it to celebrate how far you've come. That's not just admirable, it's extraordinary. We drove back to Boston that afternoon, and over the following weeks, the ripple effects of our wedding appearance continued to spread through our social circles. Friends who hadn't spoken to me since the divorce suddenly wanted to reconnect. Invitations to parties and events that had stopped coming began arriving again. It was as if our appearance at Daniel's wedding had somehow rehabilitated my social status, proof that I wasn't the broken, pitiable figure people had assumed I'd become. But the most interesting development was what happened to Daniel and Jessica's marriage in the months that followed. Through mutual friends and the inevitable gossip networks, I learned that their relationship had become increasingly strained after the wedding. The carefully constructed image they'd presented began to crack almost immediately. Jessica, it turned out, hadn't been prepared for the reality of being married to a man who was clearly still processing his feelings about his ex-wife. The woman who'd been so confident about her ability to replace me suddenly found herself competing with a ghost. Not the broken woman Daniel had left, but the transformed woman who'd walked into their wedding and reminded him of everything he'd lost. They lasted 8 months. When Emily called to tell me about their separation, I felt nothing but a distant sympathy for two people who'd built their relationship on the shaky foundation of believing they were better than what came before them. "Aren't you even a little bit satisfied?" Emily asked. "After everything they put you through?" "Honestly, no, I'm too busy being happy with my own life to spend energy on theirs. Their relationship failing doesn't make mine better. My relationship is better because of who Alex and I are together, not because of how we compare to anyone else." And that, I realized, was the real victory. Not that Daniel and Jessica had failed, but that their success or failure had become irrelevant to my happiness. I'd built something so solid with Alex that other people's relationships couldn't touch it. 6 months later, Alex and I were married in a small ceremony overlooking the Tuscan countryside, surrounded by people who loved us for who we actually were rather than who they needed us to be. The photos from that day show two people who looked genuinely uncomplicated happy, not performing happiness or trying to prove anything to anyone, but simply existing in a moment of pure joy. Daniel didn't attend our wedding. He wasn't invited. Epilogue. The Phoenix Rises. 2 years later, I stood in the bathroom of my hotel suite in Paris, putting the finishing touches on my makeup before the International Marketing Conference, where I'd be delivering the keynote address. The woman in the mirror bore no resemblance to the broken shell who'd once sat on a bathroom floor, wondering if she'd ever feel whole again. My consulting business had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible. I had clients on 3 continents, a team of associates who worked with me on major projects, and a reputation for helping brands navigate complex cultural transitions. The confidence I'd rebuilt after my divorce had become the foundation for professional success that exceeded even my most ambitious dreams. Alex appeared in the mirror behind me, adjusting his tie for the conference dinner, where he'd be presenting his latest sustainable energy innovations to European investors. We'd been married for 18 months, and the easy partnership we'd built continued to amaze me. We challenged each other professionally, supported each other's ambitions, and had created a life that felt both adventurous and stable. "Ready to change the world?" he asked, kissing my temple in a way that wouldn't disturb my carefully applied lipstick. "Always," I replied, touching the Phoenix bracelet he'd given me before Daniel's wedding. I still wore it every day, not as a reminder of what I'd overcome, but as a symbol of what I'd chosen to become. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Saw your interview in Forbes magazine. You look like the brilliant powerhouse you've always been. Also, guess who's getting divorced again? Hint, rhymes with flannel." I showed Alex the message and we both laughed. Daniel's brief marriage to Jessica had been followed by an even briefer relationship with someone new, which had apparently also ended in spectacular fashion. Through the social media posts of mutual friends, I could see he was still chasing whatever it was he thought he wanted, still looking for happiness in external validation rather than internal growth. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he hadn't invited you to that wedding?" Alex asked as we gathered our things for the evening. I considered the question as we rode the elevator down to the hotel lobby, where a car was waiting to take us to the conference center. Would we have met anyway? Would I have found my way to this life through some other path? "I think we would have found each other eventually," I said finally. "But I'm grateful for how it happened. That wedding was the final test of who I'd become, and passing it gave me the confidence to build everything that came after. The conference dinner was everything I'd learned to expect from these events. Brilliant people discussing innovative ideas over excellent wine in a setting designed to inspire collaboration and creativity. I delivered my keynote to a standing ovation, then spent the evening in conversations with potential clients and partners who were excited about the possibilities we might create together. But the moment that crystallized, everything happened during the cocktail reception, when a young woman approached me with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she had something important to say. Ms. Morgan, I'm Sarah Chen. I attended your presentation this afternoon and I wanted to thank you. For the presentation? For the lesson, she said. Not just the professional insights, though those were brilliant, but for showing that it's possible to rebuild your life completely. I'm going through a divorce right now, and seeing what you've accomplished, it gives me hope that I can create something better for myself. I looked at this young woman, probably in her late 20s, clearly intelligent and capable, but carrying the same shell-shocked expression I'd worn in those first months after Daniel left. I saw myself in her uncertainty, but I also saw her potential. You absolutely can, I told her. But you have to be willing to let go of who you were and embrace who you're becoming. The woman your ex-husband left behind? She's not who you have to be forever. She's just who you happen to be in that moment. We talked for another 20 minutes about rebuilding, about finding strength in unexpected places, about the difference between surviving heartbreak and using it as fuel for transformation. When she walked away, I saw something in her posture that hadn't been there before, the beginning of the confidence that would carry her toward whatever came next. Alex appeared at my elbow with fresh champagne and the kind of smile that suggested he'd overheard our conversation. That was beautiful, he said. She reminds me of who I used to be. She reminds me of who you've always been, underneath everything else. The woman I met in Milan was already there when Daniel married you. He just couldn't see her worth. Later that evening, as we walked along the Seine in the soft light of the Parisian street lamps, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The broken marriage that had felt like the end of everything. The slow, painful work of rebuilding my sense of self. The risks I'd taken in pursuit of something better. The moment I'd walked into Daniel's wedding and realized I'd outgrown the entire story. Every step had been necessary. Every setback had taught me something I needed to know. Every small victory had built the foundation for the life I was living now. Do you think Daniel ever figured out what he was really looking for? I asked Alex as we paused on a bridge overlooking the illuminated cathedral. I think Daniel is still looking for someone else to make him happy, Alex replied. He never learned that happiness is something you create, not something you find. I leaned against the bridge railing, looking out at the city that had become one of our favorite places in the world. In a few weeks, we'd be back in Boston working on our respective projects and planning our next adventure. In a few months, we'd be traveling to Tokyo for a conference where I'd be presenting research on global consumer behavior. In a few years, we'd probably be somewhere entirely new, building something I couldn't even imagine yet. The future stretched ahead of us, full of possibilities and choices and opportunities to keep becoming better versions of ourselves. And at the center of it all was the truth I'd learned in the hardest possible way. The only person who could save me was me. Everything else, love, success, happiness, peace, had grown from that foundation. My phone buzzed with one last message of the day, this one from Emily. Saw your keynote online. You made me cry happy tears. Also, you and Alex look disgustingly perfect together. Love you, you brilliant phoenix. I showed Alex the message and he laughed softly. Phoenix, he said thoughtfully. It's perfect. You didn't just survive what happened to you, Claire. You used it to become something extraordinary. We walked back to our hotel through the quiet streets of Paris, two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something that felt both magical and sustainable. Behind us, the city glittered with promise. Ahead of us, our suite overlooked the Eiffel Tower, which would be sparkling on the hour like a celebration designed just for us. I thought about Daniel one last time, not with anger or regret, but with the distant gratitude you might feel toward a storm that destroyed your old house but left you free to build something better in its place. He'd given me the greatest gift possible, though he'd never understand it. The chance to discover who I really was when everything else was stripped away. And who I really was, it turned out, was someone who could rise from ashes and soar. The phoenix had learned to fly. Sometimes the people who think they've buried you don't realize they've actually planted seeds. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. Sometimes the only way to discover your true strength is to have everything you thought you needed taken away. My lesson: never waste energy proving yourself to someone who chose to leave. Instead, pour all that energy into becoming the best version of yourself. Trust me, success, self-respect, and genuine love are louder than any revenge speech you could ever give. So if your ex invited you to their wedding, what would you do? Would you ignore it, go and cause a scene, or show up looking like their biggest mistake come to life? Because somewhere out there, a Daniel is planning a wedding, and a Claire is planning her arrival. The choice is always yours.